So I'll start off talking about the dry beans here. And this is the biggest unknown for me. I don't have a lot of answers within this, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing here just to put it out there so that I could get some feedback for what we're supposed to be doing differently. This is only my second year of growing dry beans. I had a few acres out last year, kind of an R&D cost kind of experiment. And I'm trying that with a number of different things. We've got some open pollinated red corn on a couple acres. We've got some Paulus oats this year. I have a few acres of sunflowers that went behind barley. I'm trying to do a few acres every year of a couple different things of just pure R&D. And if we get nothing harvested off the 3 acres that we're doing the open pollinated corn, that's fine. We'll learn something. A lot of the stuff I'm trying is not going to work. But if we get maybe a third of it ends up finding a way into our rotation and it improves the farm, then that works for me. So moving from 3 acres last year, 5 acres of dry beans to like 75 this year is perhaps quicker ramping things up than I'm usually comfortable with. But the price in black beans looks a whole lot better this year than the price in corn or soybeans or anything else. So we're going to try this. A little bit of a backstory here. This field the last few years has been in strip cropping. So we were running 8 rows of corn, 8 rows of soybeans, and we flip-flop those back and forth each year. And the idea here is that you're going to increase your corn yields with increased light interception on the edges, and the whole field ends up being more profitable over the long term. That system operates on the assumption that light is your limiting factor. And on our soils, I'm increasingly finding moisture is our limiting factor, that we just run out of soil moisture at some point in the season, and that really caps our yields. So we were seeing maybe a 10, 15, 20% increase in the corn yields, but it wasn't enough to really justify doing that system long term. And it really restricted what we could do with rotations in the field. Because if you start stacking up these multiple year effects, it gets hard to rotate small grains through that field. We just don't have the diversity potential if we're whole scale doing something different. So pulled it out of that system this year and put dry beans into it. What that means is we've got different cover crops in each one of these strips. So last year on the acres that were into soybeans, after soybean harvest, it came through and planted twin row rye as a cover crop. But I guess it would have been on top of those soybean rows. So on some of these strips out here, you can see that we've got cereal rye that was run down and rolled down at planting. On some of these other strips that were into corn last year, we had interseeded a mix of covers. And not an awful lot persisted through the winter. Part of the reason I'm trying to push a little harder of what is going to persist. But in that 30-inch strip out here, in between those corn rows, we had a pretty good stand of annual rye. There was some dwarf Essex rape that was flowering, some hairy vetch, and a few radishes made it through, some brassica, some of those species. So a row orientation on this then of when we planted is we were planting these dry beans in between twin rows of cereal rye. Worked really well. The rye rolls down, a lot of it gets run down by the planter. Right after planting, we came through and ran a rolling basket Harrow over this. I don't have a roller. It's one of the things that's probably on the list for next year. But that Harrow that I borrowed from one of the neighbors that's designed to go behind his field cultivator, it did a pretty good job of rolling down most of the rye here. That worked well. The beans have looked great in these strips. The rye has held back the weed competition pretty well. We didn't have specific competition in the row, so there isn't an awful lot of crop residue. These black beans have looked pretty good in here. In planting into over the top of those 30-inch cover crop rows from last year, the stand has struggled. My Great Plains planter that I'm planting is not ideally set up for dry beans, really. We don't have active downforce onto it. There's some things that we could do to, I think, give ourselves a better shot of getting a better stand on top of that cover crop strip next year. We're probably a little too thick on the annual rye. It didn't help either that our seed quality wasn't the greatest that we got. This was seed that came out from out west, and it ended up showing up with a germ of like 75% or something like this. So we bumped up the seeding rate a little bit. The stand has not been as good into these strips out here. And the biggest challenge for me is what are we trying to do with herbicides to hold back weeds? With the strip crop field out here, we've had a little bit poorer weed control over the years. So our seed bank is probably a little bit more built up in this field than others. I'm worried about mare's tail escaping. I'm worried about getting a hold on some of these weeds. So the biggest question for me is, what do we put down for a pre for dry beans if we're not incorporating any herbicides? And you see the list up there. We're running a number of different products at like micro rates, right? We're adopting a sugar beet philosophy here. Some of those products are really not recommended if we're not going to incorporate them. So we backed off the rates a little bit. I've bent the ear of a number of different people of what they think I should do. So this is kind of where we ended up. Again, mare's tail is my biggest fear out here, that we're going to have that escape and run rampant. So you'll see there, I've got an application of gramoxone to burn down. And then like 2 days later, we came back through with Liberty. Obviously, that's not very cost effective. But the gramoxone didn't seem to smoke all the mare's tail. And I figured better off to throw a little bit more money at this into the Liberty before these beans came up than have mare's tail escapes that we just can't do anything with later in the season. We'll get better at that next year. It's not going to be a kind of a standard operating procedure here. So far, the fields look awful clean. We've turned dry in the last 2 weeks. And these beans, I thought were looking pretty good. They're getting a little yellow color to them now. They're not looking fantastic. Planting density, we planted them at, I think, 110,000, 120, something like that. That was the target. We bumped up the rate a little bit because of that poor germination. So we were shooting for a stand of like 110, 120, something like that. Again, I mean, they're twin rows. I don't have a great sense of really what we should be shooting for here. A few different things. The field is predominantly blacks. We are something like 60, 80 miles outside of the traditional black bean production region in Michigan. For those that aren't like local to the area, most of the dry bean production in Michigan is up in that Saginaw Valley, up in the Thumb. This general area used to have dry beans, and I can't have anybody give me a good reason why we don't have them anymore. Our soils certainly aren't as conducive to them. But again, I mean, I mentioned before, our average soybean yields are like 45, 50, that they're not 80. So we're not going to get as good of a dry bean crop as we can get in the Thumb. But I'm figuring that the fact they're going to be just as competitive for us as they would be with soybeans up in the Thumb. We are going to have to truck these, but they're a low volume crop. It just kind of factors in of what the cost per bushel to market these will end up being. So the field is majority black beans. I have a couple strips. There's a row or 8 rows of pintos out here, a couple rows of navies. I don't have a great sense of what those different classes are going to competitively do for yield in our system. But I'm also interested of building a little bit more opportunity to market some of the stuff as local food. And to some extent, I mean, that's where we're going down this road with the open pollinated red corn a bit, with the sunflowers to some extent. There's a lot of market development behind that. There's a lot of work that has to happen with that. But you can't sell something unless you start having it. So we're going to try a few different things and see how they work, see how we can build out markets. And more broadly speaking, the move into dry beans here for me is, I'm really concerned about where we go within our ag systems of, we're exporting all of our beans to China, we're making a ton of our corn into ethanol, we're not growing food crops. I want to move our farm as a smaller farm into a system that focuses a little bit more on food, can hopefully kind of flounder our way into resonating with consumers that are nearby, of folks that value how their food crops are grown. I have no interest in going to organic from the fact that I don't want the soil disturbance and the tillage. I'll contend that the low herbicide rates that we're trying to go with are better off for our system than tilling the soil and doing harm that way. We're close to population centers. We're about a half hour from Jackson, Lansing, Ann Arbor, not too far from Detroit. Building out an entire marketing segment around food crops like this isn't necessarily my forte, but I'm working with others and trying to build some work within that. So again, it's putting our money where our mouth is a little bit, trying our hand at more food crops and diversifying out our system. Agronomically, I love the idea of the dry beans from the fact that we can get our winter cereals planted a little bit earlier, barley, rye, wheat, those sorts of things. We've struggled the last few years. Our weather patterns are, it's been really wet in the summers, it gets dry in the really wet in the spring, gets dry in the summer, and then it starts getting wet again for us in the fall. And we've struggled to getting timely plantings of our winter cereals. if we can get the dry beans out of here early on, it should boost our cropping, our yields on those small grains on the back end as well. So interested of thoughts as kind of we go through. I'll try to keep some updates going with this field through the rest of the year. But it's certainly been a learning experience. One of the biggest lessons for me next year is the fact that I want to broadcast cereal rye into the corn stubble this fall that we're going to go into. The rye's done a great job suppressing weeds, and I want to make sure we're utilizing that again next year.